Well, welcome to the Prairie Astronomy Club. We appreciate you taking your time this afternoon to learn about how to buy a telescope. We're not going to go through every detail, every little nuance about buying a telescope, but what we want to do is kind of give you a background, just kind of a basics of some of the things to look for when buying a telescope, and maybe some of the things that you want to try to avoid. And today we've got several experts that are going to be speaking. I think collectively we have over an average of 30 years worth of astronomy experience in this room today. So you'll be able to hopefully interact with some of those key players. Those of you that are online, if you want to send a question in, I think we have that capability, and Jason will forward it on to you. Those here in the audience that have any questions, just let us stop. We'd much rather have a dialogue than a presentation, but we'll do the best we can to make it work for you. So my name is Bob Kavinsky. I'm past president of the Prairie Astronomy Club. Coordinating the program today is Jason O'Flaherty. He's the present president of the Prairie Astronomy Club. I'll introduce the other three speakers when they come up during the presentation. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, there we go. Got to hit the right button. Is this on?
Get the mouse. Yeah.
There we go. So a couple things we're going to cover today throughout the program is first kind of what to expect from a telescope, a little bit about the basic styles of telescope. There's three types, and we're going to talk about those three types. And we have three experts that are going to share those some experiences with you and kind of show you a couple examples that we have here today at Hyde. We're going to talk a little bit about telescope mounts. Mounts are really important, and that's basically how this telescope is set up, so for stability. And then kind of who to buy from. We have a list that is available that we can put online, or we can post it for those of you that are here. And then kind of a little bit about what's next. We've got some follow-up that we'll be working with on over the next couple months as you look at your Christmas purchases. So what can you see through a telescope? Well, this is the pictures that you see in magazines, nice in color, big and beautiful, a lot of stars, this is the Orion Nebula, the Andromeda Galaxy. It's our sister galaxy, about 2.5 million light years away. And this is not really what you're going to see in most amateur telescopes. More than likely, this is kind of more of the picture of what you're going to see. This is an 8-inch telescope, a good size amateur telescope, and you can see the central core along with the kind of the filaments kind of standing out, almost like a little bit of a nebulosity or cloud-like appendages. You can see one of its sister galaxies down here, and you can also see this little fuzzball here. That's actually this.
Oh, sorry, that was my bad.
Nope, no, that's hit the wrong button. So go back one, would you, for me? Can you do that? I can't. Oh, there it is. So here you get a little bit more detail. You can see that what we call M110. It just happens to be its designation. You can see a telescope. That's that little fuzzball right there. But in most amateur telescopes, you're going to see black and white. We don't see a lot of color unless we get a lot of contrast. Typically, it'll be black and white or grayscale, and what you'll see is this is more likely a picture that you're going to look at. So that kind of gives you a perspective of what type of images you're going to see. Magazine pictures are thousands and thousands of pictures stacked together and over a long period of time, and they collect that all together through computers, and then they enhance them with color. We don't have that capability with our eyes, so what you're going to see is the basics. So next. Three things that you'd like to consider when you're buying a telescope. The first thing, and most importantly, is the type of telescope. We call that an OTA, or optical tube assembly, a fancy term for basically saying the guts of the main mirror and the main image, the main glass that's in the telescope. The aperture, which is the size of the telescope, we'll talk about that a little bit more, and then the basic mount. The mount is what it sits on in order to make it stable and be able to observe for. So we're going to talk about those three parts of the telescope. We're going to talk about each of these telescopes independently, but just to give you a basic summary to begin with, of the three basic types of telescopes. The first one is called a refractor. Think of the old pirate ship, looking through one end and glass at the other end. Basically, the light comes in on this end of the telescope. It comes down. There's a focal point in which that light is then focused into or or refracted to. That's why it's called a refractor. And then an eyepiece is added in order to take that image and be able to see through it. The second type of telescope is called a Schmidt-Cassegrain or Cassegrain reflective. Basically, it takes this telescope and kind of folds it up a little bit, so it makes it shorter, kind of the one concept to look at. The light comes in, it's a secondary or primary mirror on the bottom of the telescope that focuses into a smaller mirror that's in the center of the telescope and then back down into the end. And this is called a Schmidt-Cassegrain. You'll hear that term once in a while from the speakers. Cassegrain is the most common name, or Schmidt-Cassegrain is the most common. There's several versions of this, but basically when you look at a magazine, it's going to have this Cassegrain or it's going to have a Schmidt-Cassegrain as a primary way it's going to be described for most amateur-type telescopes. And then the third one is called a Newtonian. Newtonian is a very simple telescope that has a large mirror at the bottom of the tube, and then it reflects that over to a secondary mirror that's up towards the top, and then that reflects it out into where the eyepiece is assembled. So those are the three basic types of telescopes, and we're going to spend a few minutes on each of these now. So first of all, let's talk about the refractor, and I'm going to let Dave Knisley. Dave Knisley is a veteran member, one of the original members of Prairie Astronomy Club, and he's going to discuss with you the refractors, the benefits and advantages, and the basic design. So, Dave, please take it over.
Well, this is one little one. The nice thing about the refractor is it's simple. That's its biggest advantage. There's one set of lenses at the front of it and another at the back. There's nothing to get out of alignment or anything else. They tend to be the most expensive for the aperture. We talk about aperture. That's how big this lens or mirror is. And this is a little 80 millimeter aperture telescope. It's a nice little thing. It's very popular and it's very portable and it's not very expensive. But once you get in a particular size, get a problem of cost. The cost goes way up. So these tend to be the most expensive types of telescopes. They're fairly cheap in the small size, but they're not very cheap if you want to get something very big. And in order to see fainter, you have to have what's called aperture. The larger the objective lens or the mirror in the telescope is, the fainter objects you'll see and the more detail you'll see in them. The refractor is sealed, so there's no dust getting inside of it, although you do have to cover the cap a little bit sometimes to keep dust off of it. There's no secondary mirror to lose light, no obstruction. They give very, very good images, but again, because this has to bend light, we have a problem. The lenses tend to act like prisms. They bend different colors of light differently, and that can cause what's called chromatic aberration. In other words, you have to have at least two lenses to correct that. In some cases, you have to use 3 or even 4 lenses, so that ups the price even more. But you'll find these in, we talk about the department store refractors. They're usually about 2.4 inches across. That's how big the main lens is. They're long focal length. They tend to be rather poor quality, unfortunately. So you have to pay a little bit of money to get a halfway decent one. They also don't sometimes come with very good finder scopes. This is another refractor that sits up on piggyback on top of it that allows you to lock in on the object. It's kind of like the rifle scope on a rifle. The same idea. This has a very wide field of view. So it's a huge area of the sky with big crosshair on it. The crosshair, you put it on the crosshair and then look at the telescope. There's the object. So the refractors are pretty good. They're not very... They're pretty much self-sustaining. You don't have to do anything with them. You don't have to line them. They're a little bit hard to look at straight up sometimes, but you have what's called the star diagonal on them that kicks the light off to the side and makes it really easy to look through. So that's the refractor.
Let's talk about the disadvantages.
Okay. Gotta make that go one more. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, we talked about this. This is chromatic aberration. The light from different colors gets focused at different points. So you have to use 2 lenses at least. And in a short focal length refractor, sometimes you have to use 3 lenses to get the colors to focus correctly. And they're quite a bit more expensive. This scope is probably about, $200. If you wanted something a little bit bigger, you'd be looking at thousands of dollars. A 6-inch one that has like that. We like to say 6 inches is a nice, easy spot to look at. A 6-inch refractor would probably cost about, probably $4,000 to $5,000 for just this part of it. So it's pretty expensive. But for small telescopes, very small telescopes, the refractor is probably the way to go. You want me to see anything else? Okay.
Okay, the next type of telescope we're going to talk about is the what's called a Schmidt-Cassegrain. And why isn't that? There he goes. And today with us is Jim White. Jim does quite a bit of work with his Schmidt and his Cassegrain, and he's going to share with us kind of the benefits and advantages and disadvantages of the basic style of this telescope. Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, the Schmidt-Cassegrain is pretty compact for the size of the scope. By sending the light down to the mirror, back to the secondary and back through, they're kind of folding everything up. So a Schmidt-Cassegrain, mine's a 9 1/4 inch. It's a 93 inch focal length. It's a sealed design. It has, it does have vents to atmosphere, but it's hard for dust to get in to get the mirrors dirty. You do have what they call a corrector plate that's on the end, and that collects dust and a little bit of dirt once in a while, and we clean them. We don't clean them unless they really get dirty. Yeah, they're, like I say, they're really compact, and the chromatic aberration is not bad in a high quality Schmidt.
Get to the disadvantages.
Yeah, it's not moving.
Move that forward.
I gotcha.
Yeah, thank you.
The Cassegrains can be heavy in if you go up to, say, a 14-inch Schmidt Cassegrain, they're just under 50 pounds for the optical tube assembly. They have the secondary mirror is larger than what you'll have in like a Newtonian, so it blocks a little bit more light than what a Newtonian does. And they're a little more expensive. They're, because of the corrector plates and the extra glass in them, you can spend anywhere from, for a small 5-inch, probably around $500 to several $1,000. If you get up into a 14, they're probably $5,000.
Okay. Thank you, Jim. We'll talk a little bit more about these types of scopes in a moment. Next up is Jim Voshnicka. Jim is a member of the Prairie Astronomy Club and has had about 25 years of experience or more with telescopes. And he has been working extensively with Newtonians, and he'll share with you their advantages and disadvantages.
Well, first of all, I'm Jim Voshnick. I am presently the observing chair for the Prairie Astronomy Club. I do not have the 25 years that Bob said I do, but I joined the club in 2004. And the first telescope I purchased when I joined the club was a 6-inch Newtonian reflector, and I had it on an equatorial mount, and then I used that for a year, and I upgraded to a 10-inch Newtonian on a Dobsonian mount. Advantages of the Newtonian reflector: it's the least expensive design manufactured to get large aperture. So you're going to get the most aperture for your money in a Newtonian reflector. And they're available in larger apertures than most other designs. You can easily start with the 6 or 8-inch or 10-inch Newtonian reflector, and you can go up to a lot higher than that. We've got people that have been using 16-inch reflectors in our club, and if you go to large star parties, you'll see up to 30-inch reflectors being used. They're available in designs that can be easily broken down into much smaller pieces for transport and storage. The nice thing, up to a 10-inch Newtonian reflector, a Dobsonian, that will easily fit in the back seat of most cars. the optical tube assembly will. The base you can easily put in your trunk, so it's easy to transport. You go to much larger than that, you start getting into a 12-inch or bigger, it's not going to fit in your back seat. It's not going to be that much easier to transfer. Also, the bigger the scope you go, the bigger the optical tube assembly is going to start weighing more. The base is going to start weighing more. You have to take that into account. Disadvantages, again, the large aperture can be kind of awkward. It can be a little bit heavy and more difficult to transport. Newtonians have an open tube. This allows dust to get into your telescope, so your mirror might get a little dirty. You may have to clean that occasionally. And the optics need to be aligned often. Usually most of us that have Newtonian reflectors will do what we call collimation, aligning of our mirrors every time we use it to make sure the mirrors are aligned and get our best observing. So, okay.
Okay, thank you, Jim. So let's go back and talk a little bit about just a couple things. Jim mentioned about the Newtonians having to be cleaned. I think most of us will clean our mirrors about once a year. Does that sound about right, Jim? And for our Newtonians, you keep a cap on them, keep the covers on, and you keep the dust out. And mine sits in my garage, and yet I clean it about once a year because it's been sealed up and covered. The other thing there to remember about them is that when we collimate or realign, the smaller telescopes, the 4.5, 6 or 8 inch telescopes, they don't get out of alignment very much unless you really bang them around. Now the larger telescopes, because the weight of the mirror is a little bit heavier, gravity will play and you'll get a little bit of disalignment, but usually most star parties, at least at a Prairie Astronomy Club, when we have star parties, there's always people with collimating tools, and we help people collimate their telescopes all the time. So typically that's a pretty minor issue, but it's something that we can teach you how to do. So there's just a couple things I'll add to Jim's comments about a telescope. So let's move on to aperture. So when we talk about aperture just means the size of the mirror. Dave talked about this a little bit when he was talking about the refractors, just the overall size of the mirror. The bigger the mirror, the bigger the eyeball. Think about it this way. The telescope is nothing more than a great big eyeball. Our little 1/8 inch pupils in our eyes is a pretty small little telescope. But when we look at a telescope, it's just about getting a bigger eyeball. In fact, every telescope in the world, including those in space, have the same power as your eyeball. They don't power the image. What they're doing is they're providing more information at the eyepiece. The bigger the eyeball, the more you can gather from an object, the more information you gather, the more light you gather, the more detail you gather, and that allows you at the eyepiece to be able to manipulate that. So that it's all about getting aperture, because the amateur astronomers always call aperture rules. And the reason why is the bigger the eyeball, the more information you get, the more we can do with it at the eyepiece. So that's the reason why we talk about aperture. So these are 3 different types of aperture. We talked about a typical amateur telescope that a lot of us started out with, the 6 or 8 inch. This is what you would see when you're looking at in this case, a globular cluster. Kind of the detail. When you move up to a 12.5, that's probably an intermediate sized telescope usually it's not a starter telescope, but one that typically that you would upgrade to at some point. My 12 inch, I upgraded from an 8 inch after about 16 years, so it kind of gives you perspective. More detail, more information at the eyepiece, more detail. And then of course the 15 inch you just add. Every time you add an inch, remember that going from an 8 inch to a 12 inch, it's 50% larger. But it's almost 2.8 times more information, because every inch you add is a lot more square inches of eyeball than that inside inch. So each inch adds a much greater than just the sheer size of it. So aperture is all about how big an eyeball you have. The more eyeball, the more information, and the more detail that you can go with. Okay? So when we talk about field of view, and and this is also an important, that the aperture that we look at in that small scope, I can't remember, you had an 80? So it's about a
It's
little over 3 inch, roughly about a 3 inch
Yeah.
aperture. Whereas this 8 inch over here or 10 inch that we're looking, 8 inch that we're looking at. So that's an 8 inch aperture. So you just got a bigger eyeball, more information that you can gather. And it's all about increasing the overall square inches of your eye so that you can get more detail and information. Go ahead to the next one. Oh, and then there's a degree of field. Now, for most amateur telescopes, we don't get too worried about this degree of field of the actual scope itself. It does have a bigger play when it comes into a refractors than it does with the Newtonians. So for most of us, the field of view is, for amateur telescopes tends to be mostly at the eyepieces. And I had an experiment that I was going to show, but unfortunately, because of our situation here on site and we have people online, the thing to do would be take a straw, just like this, put some kind of a blockage so that you can't look around it, and then take a toilet paper tube. Field of view. A lot of our small telescopes come with eyepieces that are called plazos. Plazos most cases tend to have a pretty small piece of glass in the middle. You're looking through a peephole. Try to look at the moon or some object or even something in your house through these two pieces of apparatus. This one is much more, you're going to be squinting through this eyepiece. You're going to be having a difficult time being able to see any detail because it's a very small field of view. Whereas with the tube, you can see a lot more detail. Dave mentioned on the refractor, he showed you that secondary, that smaller telescope that he had on top had a big field of view. The more field of view you have, the more detail you can see, and you can find that little object in the middle. It's a lot easier to find than having something that's only focused on that little bitty object in the center. So field of view is very important. On amateur telescopes, the field of view of the eyepiece tends to be as important as the field of view of the telescope itself. It's about how much of the sky you're looking at. And the bigger that piece of the sky is, the easier it is on your eye. You get less eye fatigue. And more importantly, you get to see that contrast so you can pick out that object a little bit easier. So we tend to like to see these eyepieces that have bigger field of view so we can see a little bit more of the space around it. Next one, please. So when we're looking at it, if we're looking at Saturn, for instance, if all you could see is this part of the picture, if you were focused only, if your telescope was focused, if you're just a little bit off, you wouldn't see it. But if Saturn is part of a much bigger part of the sky, you can pick it out really easily. So that's really what it's all about. Next slide. Okay, so then what about magnification? So when you go to, and you can go to several of these dime stores or hobbyist stores, you'll find little telescopes. And Dave mentioned some of these kind of inexpensive $120, $130 kits that you can buy. The problem, there's two things that typically come into play. One is the mount itself is extremely flimsy, so it tends to vibrate. If you ever tried to look at a moon with a pair of binoculars and you see it and then you don't, even with your little bit of shaking, well, imagine that's with a tube this long. If you put a tube out this long, you're going to really lose that moon very rapidly. So it has to be extremely solid and stable. And most of those telescopes that are low cost like that tend to be pretty flimsy. The second thing is that their field of view tends to be a challenge. And then they claim that you can go up to 600 power, which is absolutely ridiculous because at 600 power, you can't even find the moon. It's just going to be a glare of a glob of light. So it's all about, in physics, they call it the inverse square rule. And basically, it's 1 over x squared. What it is if, say, I'm starting at 50, and I go to 100 power, I double it. That's 2 squared, or I get 1/4 the amount of information at the eyepiece. If I double it again, that's 1/4. All of a sudden now I'm looking at 1/16 the amount of information at the eyepiece. When we buy telescopes, we buy bigger aperture telescopes, bigger eyeballs, so we can use lower power, get more information, and be able to get it, and we want it lower power. Most of us will run between 40 and 120, 130, maybe up to 150 on some of the planets power on our telescopes. Once in a while we'll play around at 200-300 power, but most of us are observing between 30, 40-ish on the bottom side up to about somewhere around 100 power on our telescopes. And the reason why is we want that nice sharp image instead of that fuzzball. You know, you don't get a lot of detail there. We want to see more detail. So it's contrary to what you see when you see the advertisement. It's not about how much power. It's about how clear the image can be and how good the optics are in the telescope. And that's what's more important. So smaller telescopes, magnification, if they're making a claim of 500, 600, 700 power, probably not the telescope you want to buy, because more than likely it's not a very good telescope. That's just typically what you'll see in those types of situations. Next slide. So I think we're up to the OTAs, and I think we're switching to Jim. Jim Moshnick. Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a look at the OTA, the optical tube assembly, the impact on price. Here, this is a 10-inch Newtonian reflector, OTA. This is a typical what you'll get on a Dobsonian mount. Price is about $1,100. Now, if we go to a Schmidt-Cassegrain in a 10-inch OTA, we're up to just almost $3,100. And then if we go to refractor, 10-inch refractor, achrochromatic OTA, we're talking you're going to have to mortgage your house. So it's $32,000, even a little more. So you can see the impact the different types of OTAs has on the price of a telescope. Next one. Aperture, again, impact on price. Basically, what we're looking at here is the same telescope. This is a Dobsonian reflector. First one is an 8-inch, second one is a 10-inch, and the third one is a 12-inch. You can see the impact the different OTAs has on the price. 8-inch you get for about $700. 10-inch will jump up to about $1,100. The 12-inch will go up to about $1,500. So that's the impact different size will have on the price. Next one. The mounts will also have an impact on the price you pay, the different types of mounts. 6-inch Orion on a Dobsonian mount, and then I can't see the price there. I think it's about the same, about $600. $550. And then the Orion AstroView 6-inch on an equatorial mount be about $600. Not a lot of difference, but thing on the equatorial mount, the bigger the OTA, say you had like a 10-inch OTA and tried to put that on an equatorial mount, you're going to pay a lot more for that mount because it'd be a lot sturdier, a lot heavier. Okay, next one. Looking at the mounts and decisions, Dobsonian reflector, usually the mount on the Dobsonian is a lot lower cost. It's very simple design, and it's very easy to set up. You can set up a Dobsonian in less than 5 minutes. Take the OTA, put it on the mount, and you're ready to go. Put in an eyepiece. The Dobsonian is very good for manual visual observing. You can get versions in the Dobsonian with the push-to tracking. Basically, once you get the scope aligned, it tells you where to push to find a certain object once you put that object in. And what's this? Manage larger OTAs without, what's the last word there?
I can't read it.
It's photography.
Oh, yeah. You can't use basically this type of a mount for astrophotography. It will not work because it does not track. So, equatorial mount, if we look at that, typically equatorial is going to be a much higher cost than a Dobsonian. It takes a little bit of detail to set it up. It's just a little bit of a learning curve. You just can't go out there and put your scope on and use it. You have to align it with the North Star and all that. So there's a little bit more work involved with it. Like again, it's going to be a bit more difficult for beginners. There's the learning curve. I can tell you right now, my personal experience, if you're somebody new trying to get a telescope, I would not start with an equatorial mount. I'm just telling that right now. It's very flexible to adaptation. You can use it You're going to get go-to systems on it once to go to different objects. It does track the object, so it can be used for astrophotography. In fact, you almost have to get an equatorial for astrophotography. Okay, next one. Again, I think Bob kind of touched on this already. Telescopes to avoid the inexpensive department store scopes. Again, you'll see a lot of these advertised up to 675 power, and it's only a little 3-inch scope, and the most magnification it can handle is 150 power, and they're advertising it at 675. You will not see anything at that high of power with it. So, okay.
Dave's up next.
Okay, thank you.
Dave Nisley is up next, and he's going to talk about some of the common accessories and things to be looking for when you're buying that first telescope. A couple of the key things to look for. Dave?
Well, one of the things we like to talk about are the part of the telescope that allows you to put the eyepiece in. It's called the focuser. And there are two different diameters of it. They're 1.25 and 2-inch. And the 1.25 is a little less expensive, and they usually come with most telescopes. They got nice little ways of focusing it, so they can move it in and out to adapt for your eye. The more common ones, they call the Crayford focuser. It's a type that isn't commonly available with regular department store telescopes. They're more rack and pinion. But again, it just allows you to move the eyepiece in and out and adapt it to your eye, because not everybody has the same eyesight. We have to adjust it a little bit to get the best focus. And you also have 2-inch eyepieces, bigger barrel eyepieces, and I should probably bring one of those out to show one. It's here. Thank you. Okay, this is an 1.25 eyepiece. Its barrel diameter is 1.25 and this is a 2-inch. 2-inch, the reason why we have these big telescope eyepieces, these wider ones, is field of view. In order to get a much wider field, it's kind of like instead of looking through your straw, you're looking through a great big wide opening. And it's almost like looking out a porthole with one of these big monsters. So these are very expensive eyepieces, by the way. The 2-inch ones are more expensive than the 1.25. So when you're buying your first telescope, you'll probably want to go with an 1.25 eyepiece and an 1.25 focuser. That's generally, we have different selections of eyepieces. You want about 2 or 3 different ones. One that gives you a nice low power for finding things, because you need a wide field of view to start out with. A lot of times if you're hunting for a deep sky object or something that's very small, you have to find where it is, and your telescope has a small field of view. Usually we like to call the field of view in degrees. A degree is about twice the diameter of the full moon. That sounds pretty big, but it really isn't. The front end, for instance, of the Big Dipper, the 2 stars, the pointer stars, they're about 5 degrees apart. So that's quite a distance. So the wider the field of view, the better you're able to find objects. And then a shorter focal length eyepiece will give you a higher magnification. We haven't talked about that very much. I don't know if we're going to talk about that too much. But for beginners, the Plossels, they're kind of garden variety. They're actually halfway decent performers. They don't have a really wide field. This is a Plossel-like eyepiece. This actually has an extra element in it. You start with a low power one, say 20 to 28 millimeters. The department store refractors that you get, like from Walmart and so forth, they generally have too short a focal length eyepieces. So they end up giving you way too much power and way too small a field of view. You need a very long focal length eyepieces for low power and wider fields, like the 20 to 28 millimeter, for instance. A lot of them will come with a 25 millimeter Plossel, which is okay. It'll get you in the ballpark. And that's the eyepiece actually you're going to probably use the most. You also have the middle and higher power range, something like the third. This is a 14 millimeter, so this is a little higher power eyepiece. And then you have ones that go down to around 6 millimeters. They're kind of hard to look through. So that's kind of where you're running at your maximum power for looking at the planets, for instance. Then you might be using a really short focal length one. Now, to calculate the power, the magnification you have, you take the focal length of the telescope. That's a number that comes with the telescope, and divide it by the focal length of the eyepiece. So if you have a telescope with, say, 1,000 millimeter focal length, and you have a 10 millimeter focal length eyepiece, you're running 100 power. It's that simple. And again, lower power, You only want to use the high power when you want to look at, say, the moon or the planets. Otherwise, you're going to be under 100 power most of the time. So, again, you could go to Orion. They have a nice, a little bit of a online guide to selecting eyepieces. So that's what we got from there. What's next? Okay, comparing different types. There are different types of telescopes. The Dobsonian's kind of taken over, and it's one, if we're going to talk about the most effective one, the most bang for your buck, it's the Dobsonian. It's a Newtonian telescope on an altazimuth mount. It goes up and down, side to side, just like the gun turret on a ship. That's all it does. It's very simple. You just point it and look through it. With the equatorial mount, this is a kind of spindly looking one. Not particularly good. You have to line one end up to the North Pole star and then have a motor here and get the alignment of the axis, the polar axis a little bit to go on. So they're harder to use and they're more expensive. They're used mainly for astrophotography. This is not a mount I would recommend. It's way too small and spindly, but you'll find a lot of department store refractors sold with this thing. And you'll be wondering if you're ever going to find anything with them. So the nice thing about it is, Dobsonian, it's up, down, side, side. It's really simple. They're small. They're lightweight. They don't have a lot of complexity to them. You do have to align the optics every once in a while, but it's actually not that big a deal. A little tweaking and it doesn't take maybe 5 minutes to get it lined up. And some of the smaller ones actually hold collimation pretty well. The different focusers, that's this part up here. That allows you, the more expensive ones have different speeds and so forth, but really what you need is just a basic rack and pinion, something that gets you in and out. The Crayford focusers are basically friction focusers. They're very nice, they're very smooth, but you don't actually have to have them. But if you want a Crayford focus, you're going to pay more money for them. They're a little smoother and so forth. We talk about finders. Again, with the telescope, you need the rifle scope thing. And we have two different methods. We haven't talked about the telrad too much, but to point the telescope, you need a finder scope or some way of finding things. We have several different types of finders that allow you to zero. One of them puts a little red dot on the sky. You look through it, you put the red dot on whatever you want to look at, you look at the telescope, and there it is. That's basically how it is. The other versions have a series of rings, kind of like a bullseye, and you put it on there, and you can actually navigate with this bullseye, making patterns on the stars to find out where things are. So they talk about the telrad. The telrad's a little bulkier. I don't think we have one out here.
I got one
on the 8-inch over there. Hopefully, you won't have to get the telrad out. We might want to just bring it up here, just to show them that. I don't know if we've got that on there or not, but
You're good right there.
oh, you are? Okay. This is a telrad. It puts a bullseye on the sky. You just look up through here, and when you're looking through it, all you do is then have the eyepiece in the telescope. Boom, there you are. So the telrad is really a nice way. It's a little bulkier than some red dot finders that just put the dot up there, but it's probably one of the best ways of finding things is having a telrad up there or an optical finder like this telescope has. So you just, I don't know if we've got everything else. We've got two different prices on these. The prices will vary a little bit. Recommendations, 6 or 8 inch. There are a lot of little things that they go with them. You can get packages that have, moon maps and extra eyepiece and so forth. So you'll see a range in prices. The 6-inch Dob is just, about $460, and you'll see it a little cheaper in some of them, but it may not have all the eyepieces. So you kind of have to balance a little bit when you're looking at different places. As far as places you can get telescopes, Orion telescopes out of, I don't know where they are in California, but they're online. They're not too bad. Astronomics out of Norman, Oklahoma is a good place to get them. There's several other places like that, but those two in particular are two I would recommend. Okay, we ready on that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's it.
Okay.
So, well, thank you, Dave. And the key thing, go back to that previous slide. Key thing on this slide, I apologize that when we made it up, it didn't transfer into the software very well. But this scope is going to be, it's going to be more expensive. because it's got the Crawford. Now, I had the rack and pinion on my first scope. I've had Crawford since, and I would probably disagree just with one point of it, and that is the rack and pinion, after you've used it for 16 years, it tends to get a little sloppy, so it tends to have a little bit of give. So if you're really focusing in on a real fine object, or trying to get details like a galaxy or an open cluster or a globular cluster where you're trying to get a little more background detail, it's just a little bit harder, where the friction ones tend to be a little smoother. They are more expensive, they're about $100 more, but the reality is that if you can buy a telescope that it's $70, $80 more for one that's got a Crawford, I'd probably pay the extra money for the Crawford. I'm biased because for me, if you're going to use a telescope, especially if the thing to remember is my original telescope, my daughter now uses, it's 32 years old, and it works just like it came out of the box. I just recently was there and washed it and cleaned it, and it is just as good as when it came out of the box. Telescopes, if they're taken care of properly and managed, they have a lifetime of use. So the value of a telescope is all about, don't think about it, I'm going to buy it, and 2 years later I'm going to throw it away. You will with a dime score one or the cheap ones, but if you buy a good telescope, you're not going to do that. It's going to last forever. It has that capability if it's taken care of. So that's one of the points I wanted to bring up here for this slide. So go ahead to one more slide. We talked about the finder already, and you already talked about the filters a little bit. Do you want to spend any time on filters or eyepieces?
Generally, filters are a whole ball of wax. Some people like to have moon filters that dim the moon. It's a little bright for them, so they put a moon filter in, but otherwise, don't bother with the filters right now. There's one caveat. Never point these telescopes at the sun without a full aperture solar filter. It's very, very, very dangerous. So if you find these little screw-in filters that have sun on them, don't use them because they can shatter and you can be blinded instantly. Solar observing is a whole another ball of wax. So don't bother with it right now. Don't point the telescope at the sun. You've got to get some experience before you do that, and then it requires a whole big filter that goes over the entire front end of the telescope.
If a solar filter is on this end, and it's a solar filter, it's safe.
Yeah.
If anyone that's on this end, don't look at it.
No.
Don't use it. Don't buy it. Don't even get swayed. It doesn't work on this end. It only works on this end. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah.
Unless the telescope is specifically made for the sun and only the sun. And that's a very specialized observing, and you're not going to do that as an amateur to start with. You're probably not going to buy that telescope out of the box, to be honest. You're going to want to do that at a later time. So, good point. And then most telescopes actually come with a moon filter when you buy them. That's kind of thrown in, and they're relatively expensive. They're a $20, $25 piece of glass that fits on, and it does dim it down, so it makes it easier to look like. The only others, there are color sets out there for about $25, $30 too, but generally, like Dave said, the only filter you really need for most amateur scopes is a moon filter is helpful because when it's a bright moon, it'll darken up your eyes pretty good. So that's one filter. And then we talked a little bit about the eyepieces. The most telescopes come with plazos. Those are the baseline telescope. Will come with a plazo. 25 is the standard. You already mentioned that, so I don't need to repeat that. And then usually with most of us, we'll have one medium power, like Dave had a 14 in his hand, something in that neighborhood. When you get into that 5 to 10 power, usually that's not an eyepiece for most amateur telescopes. That's probably too much power, and it's going to really dim it down. Is that a fair statement? I mean, most amateur telescopes under 6 inches, anything under 10 or under is probably going to be too much power for that telescope for almost all observing. I'll just put it that way. So let's go to the next slide. We had one more there.
I'm not sure. The formatting got messed up.
Yeah, so one other, and just forget this slide for now. I'll just make a comment about you don't have to spend thousands of dollars. We've talked a little bit about the sizing around the 6 or 8 inches for a lot of the starter telescopes, but you can buy some very, very nice 4.5-inch telescopes online from Orion, Celestron, Meade, or Skywatcher. Those are probably the 4 top brands that we work with. We're not here to advertise those 4, but those 4 tend to have very, very few mistakes. When they come out of the box, they're very high quality, very high workmanship. So generally, those are the 4 brands that we typically will see. If you need information more detailed about a telescope, you can go on the prairieastronomyclub.org site. There's a place where you can ask a question, and that question will come to our membership and our president, and he will divvy that out or answer the question, and we can help you. I think in the 5-6 years that I was the president, I probably helped about 25 people look specifically for telescopes and help them kind of select between some different styles based on what their needs are. Most important thing is to get a telescope that fits your needs, and we can help you with that. From this picture, the other thing not to forget is that if you want to spend $75 to $100 and you want to enjoy the sky, you don't have to buy a telescope. A good pair of binoculars, 10 by 50s, you can get a good 10 by 50 binoculars today for in that $75 to $100 range. In fact, even in imaging stabilizings are really cool, because if you're like me, you tend to vibrate too much or shake too much. But the reality is a really good pair of binoculars will give you just as good a view and just as much enjoyment. Plus, you can use it for a lot of other things like birds and boats and everything else. So the reality is that a telescope isn't the only way to go. It's just one way to go to enjoy the night sky. You can enjoy the night sky very nicely with a good basic pair of binoculars. 7.5 to 10. Now they've got 15 by 75s, and they're all under $150. So you can get a very, very good pair of binoculars today and not have to spend an arm and a leg and get very, very good views. And plus, the utility of the binoculars is much greater than just the night sky. So with that, what's the next slide? Okay, so we're not going to talk about photography, because that's a specialized area today, and it's not typically what we discussed in the beginning. It's one of those that if you're interested in photography, you're going to change the type of telescope that you're going to want to buy. And we've asked Jim White to maybe take a few minutes to talk a little bit about just some basic things to look for when you're talking about a telescope that you want to use for astrophotography. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jim, who was on our program earlier.
Yeah, the main thing with astrophotography, if you're going to do it with a telescope and what we call prime focus, where basically the camera attaches right to the back end of the telescope. To do that with a telescope, you're going to need a tracking mount. And generally for any long tracking, you've got to have a German equatorial mount to keep field rotation and other things from causing problems, because you have to take multiple images generally and stack them together with software. The good thing is there's a lot of free software out there for doing image stacking, doing star trails, a lot of different things you can do software-wise for little or no money invested. But to do astrophotography with a telescope, you're talking about a computerized mount, and the mount's probably going to start, depending on the size of the scope that you're using, the mounts are going to start at probably $1,000 and go up from there. And like I say, mount size is real important depending on your scope size. The bigger the scope is, the heavier duty amount you have to have for it. Is there any other slides?
Jim, there's a question that came up about, so when you take an astrophotography, you're taking a picture, are you taking a picture for an hour or two? Or most of the time, are you taking a picture, short intervals of pictures and then stacking them together? Which is most people that are doing astrophotography, which way are they using it?
Most people are doing things from exposures from under a minute up to maybe 10 minutes. That's where a lot of people settle in. And then you take those and combine those or stack them together. So you'll take multiple images. Once in a while, you'll do single image shots. But a lot of stuff is multiple images that are stacked together.
So, and the next question that came up was if somebody's interested in astrophotography, I know last spring we had a training program specifically focused on just astrophotography that was taped by the Prairie Astronomy Club as a presentation. If somebody's interested in learning more about astrophotography, where might they go to get more information?
There's a lot of information online. There's a lot of YouTube videos that you can go to and watch people doing long exposures and software that they're using for stacking photos. The internet's got an amazing amount of content for astrophotography. You can also do astrophotography without a telescope. You can do star trails just setting a camera up on a tripod, leaving it pointed in one direction, and taking 30-second exposures for an hour, and then stacking them all together. And here's an example of what we would call star trails. And it's got a tree in the foreground, and all of the stars that's just a lot of images stacked together, and the stars rotating through the sky. And you can also do photography doing single images off of a tripod. To eliminate the star trails, there's a rule of 500. So if you have a camera with a lens on it that's got 100 millimeter focal length, you take 500 divided by the focal length, gives you the basic longest exposure that you can go and not have star trails, which in that case would be about 5 seconds. And that's all I've got.
All right, thank you, Jim. So just in summary, a couple things to keep in mind when buying a telescope. We can't cover everything. There's just no physical way because there's so many options. If you've been online, looked at all, you probably found that there's an awful lot of them. We can post online or have available to you a sheet that we've put together of some of the key websites of where to go for telescopes. Dave mentioned several with Astronomics and Skywatcher and Orion, and some of the basic telescopes have their own websites along with some of the players. We've put together a list for you, and if you would like a copy of that, you can check out our website, or you can leave a message on that info@prairieastronomyclub.org, and we can get that to you. It'll basically give you a place to go. Back to the basic concept of what we talked about. Most important thing is getting aperture. The bigger the aperture, the bigger the eyeball, the more information and for the price. That's the first thing. The second thing is getting a stable mount, one that doesn't wiggle at all. As Dave mentioned, this one's a little bit wobbly. Well, that's typical with some of what we call an EQ. An equatorial mount is one like this, where it's got that weight on it that you see pictures of. That's kind of that style. The other style is the box mount, like this Dobsonian back here. And these are a lot less expensive. They're simple up and down, left and right. And the same concept is here. The only difference is this one's a lot easier to move around and it's a lot less expensive. It's basically a box mount that was designed back in the 30s. And it really is one that's become very, very popular because you can get a very, you don't spend a lot just for the mount, and it's very, very stable. The third thing we talked about is making sure that you buy a telescope that fits your needs. Now, in most cases for the Prairie Astronomy, we would tell you, before you buy a telescope, go out in the sky with some other telescopes and play with them. Look at them, see them, touch them, feel them, and actually observe in them. And that's why we invite people to come to our Prairie Astronomy Club star parties. We have 2 a month, and usually one of those days will be clear. And we have several different style of telescopes that we have out. And one of the reasons we ask people to do that is not to get you into the club, but more importantly, to get exposed to the different types so you can see the advantages and disadvantages to what you want. The ease of operation, the ease of setup, and the ease of finding, and more importantly about what you want to do with your telescope. Do you want something to sit on a picnic table when you're traveling with the family, or do you want something that's going to sit on your deck for when you have a party, or do you want something that you really want to get into astronomy and find those deep sky objects and be the first one to discover an asteroid or a comet? I mean, that's really what you want. And that's what we want you to do, is find a telescope that you will use. The worst telescope to buy is the one that only looks at stuff in your closet. It doesn't do any good. You already know what's in your closet. You don't need to look in your closet. But if that's where it sits because you can't find anything in the scope or you're not able to use it, that's a worthless piece of equipment. And what we want you to do is one that you can take outside and enjoy with the family. So if you have any other questions, please notify us through the info at prairieastronomyclub.org and leave a message, and we will get back to you shortly with a recommendation, a suggestion, or an idea, and we can help answer any questions that you have. We thank you very much for your time today and enjoy happy holidays.